The most dangerous damage to the human body does not arrive with pain or warning, it arrives through silence, through systems that keep working long after they should have rested, until endurance quietly turns into breakdown. This content is intended for educational purposes only and reflects general scientific understanding of metabolic and digestive physiology. It is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Individuals with health conditions should consult qualified healthcare professionals before making dietary or lifestyle changes. The pancreas does not collapse in a single moment, nor does it announce its distress with immediate pain. Its decline is gradual, shaped by repetition rather than. Every time blood sugar rises sharply, the pancreas responds by releasing insulin. Not as a choice, but as a biological obligation. This response is protective, meant to preserve cellular balance and keep glucose from damaging blood vessels and tissues. In the short term, it is effective. In the long term, when this demand becomes constant, the organ is forced into a state of continuous output, never fully returning to rest. Unlike organs that can visibly swell or ache, the pancreas adapts quietly. It increases insulin production, adjusts enzyme release, and compensates for metabolic stress without complaint. Cells throughout the body begin to resist insulin signal, not out of dysfunction, but as a defensive mechanism against excess energy. The pancreas responds by working harder, producing more insulin to achieve the same effect. This cycle does not indicate weakness. It reveals endurance stretch beyond its evolutionary design. Over months and years, chronic overload alters the internal environment of the pancreas itself. Inflammatory signals increase, oxidative stress accumulates, and the finely tuned balance between hormone production and cellular demand begins to shift. What appears clinically as pancreatic dysfunction is often the final visible stage of a process that began long before symptoms emerged. The organ has not failed suddenly. It has been compensating continuously. This perspective reframes disease not as a sudden malfunction, but as a record of adaptation under pressure. The pancreas is not betraying the body when it struggles. It is revealing the cost of long-term metabolic strain, written slowly into tissue and function. Refined sugars and rapidly absorbed carbohydrates place the pancreas into a biological environment it was never meant to inhabit. In nature, glucose arrives slowly, wrapped in fiber, cellular structure, and time. Modern foods remove these buffers, allowing sugar to enter the bloodstream with speed and intensity. The pancreas responds immediately, releasing insulin to prevent glucose from lingering in circulation where it can damage nerves, vessels, and organs. This response is it is precise and necessary in the moment. When this pattern repeats multiple times a day, the body begins to adapt in cells reduce their sensitivity to insulin, not because they are broken, but because they are protecting themselves from constant energy overload. Insulin resistance, often framed as pathology, is better understood as a survival mechanism in an environment of abundance. The pancreas senses this resistance and compensates by increasing insulin output, attempting to restore balance with greater hormonal force. Over time, this relentless demand alters metabolic signaling. Blood sugar becomes harder to control, insulin levels remain elevated for longer periods, and the pancreas is forced into sustained overactivity. This state is metabolically expensive. It increases inflammation, disrupts lipid metabolism, and places stress on thievery cells responsible for insulin production. Yet none of this happens overnight. It unfolds gradually, shaped by daily dietary rhythms rather than singular indulgences. Understanding this process removes blame from the individual and places responsibility on the environment and food systems that promote rapid glucose delivery. The pancreas is not damaged by sugar itself, but by the pace and frequency with which sugar is forced into circulation, turning a protective hormone into a chronic demand that slowly erodes metabolic balance. Ultra-processed foods alter digestion in a way that is subtle yet biologically significant. The pancreas evolved to respond to foods that required mechanical breakdown, enzymatic cooperation, and time. Natural foods arrive with fiber, water, and complex structures that slow digestion and distribute enzymatic demand evenly. When those structures are removed, digestion becomes chemically intense rather than biologically balanced. The pancreas must release larger quantities of enzymes in shorter periods, responding to meals that are dense in calories, yet poor in informational signals the body recognizes. This shift increases digestive workload without providing proportional nourishment. Refined fats, emulsifiers, and additives bypass normal digestive pacing, forcing pancreas into repetitive high-output states. Over time, this pattern contributes to local inflammation and enzymatic inefficiency. The organ is not malfunctioning, it is adapting to a food environment that demands speed instead of coordination. Digestion becomes less about collaboration between organs and more about compensating for missing structure. Fiber plays a critical role in this process, not as a nutrient, but as a regulator. It slows nutrient absorption, feeds beneficial gut microbes, and reduces enzymaticration on the pancreas. When fiber is absent, glucose and fats enter circulation rapidly, amplifying insulin demand and digestive strain simultaneously. The pancreas becomes responsible not only for digestion, but for managing the metabolic consequences of accelerated absorption. Over time, this constant stimulation can disrupt feedback loops that normally signal satiety and digestive completion. Meals feel less satisfying, leading to larger portions and more frequent eating, further increasing pancreatic workload. The issue is not indulgence, but architectural mismatch between modern food design and human digestive biology, where efficiency replaces harmony and the pancreas absorbs the cost of that imbalance. The pancreas does not operate in isolation. It is deeply responsive to the nervous system, hormonal signals, and the rhythms of daily life. Chronic psychological stress alters this internal communication in powerful ways. Elevated stress hormones increase blood glucose availability as part of the body's emergency response, preparing muscles and the brain for action. When this response is triggered repeatedly without physical release, glucose remains unused, and insulin demand rises. The pancreas is then tasked with correcting a problem created not by food, but by persistent stress signaling. Sleep deprivation compounds this effect. Inadequate or irregular sleep disrupts circadian control of glucose metabolism, reducing insulin sensitivity the following day. The pancreas must release more insulin to achieve the same level of blood sugar control, increasing its workload even in the absence of dietary excess. Over time, this pattern creates a baseline of metabolic strain that becomes normalized, quietly shifting pancreatic function toward chronic overactivity. Physical inactivity further intensifies the burden. Muscle tissue is a primary site for glucose disposal, and movement allows glucose to be absorbed without heavy reliance on insulin. When movement is absent, glucose remains in circulation longer, forcing the pancreas to intervene more aggressively. This is not a failure, but a physiological consequence of modern sedentary environments. Together, stress, poor sleep, and inactivity form a metabolic pressure system that amplifies pancreatic demand beyond what diet alone would produce. Even moderate eating patterns can become metabolically taxing when these factors are present. The pancreas becomes a compensator for lifestyle imbalance, absorbing signals from the brain, muscles, and endocrine systems simultaneously, revealing how health is less about isolated choices and more about the cumulative dialogue between behavior, environment, and biological response. The pancreas does not operate in isolation. It responds continuously to signals from the nervous system, endocrine pathways, and daily behavioral rhythms. Chronic psychological stress alters this communication at a fundamental level. Stress hormones elevate blood glucose as a survival mechanism, ensuring immediate energy availability. When this response is activated repeatedly without corresponding physical activity, glucose remains circulating longer than necessary, and insulin demand rises inappropriately. The pancreas is then compelled to manage a metabolic imbalance created not by diet, but by persistent neuroendocrine signaling. Sleep deprivation further destabilizes this system. Inadequate sleep disrupts circadian regulation of glucose metabolism, impairing insulin sensitivity the following day. As a result, the pancreas must release greater quantities of insulin to achieve normal glucose control. This increased workload occurs even when food intake remains unchanged, revealing how metabolic stress can accumulate independently of eating behavior. Over time, this pattern shifts pancreatic function toward chronic compensation rather than recovery. Physical inactivity intensifies the burden. Skeletal muscle serves as a primary reservoir for glucose disposal, and regular movement allows glucose uptake with minimal insulin involvement. When movement is absent, glucose clearance slows, forcing the pancreas to intervene more frequently and with greater hormonal output. This is a physiological consequence of sedentary environments rather than a reflection of individual failure. Together, chronic stress, disrupted sleep, and inactivity form a reinforcing loop that amplifies pancreatic demand. The pancreas becomes a metabolic mediator for lifestyle imbalance, responding simultaneously to psychological pressure, circadian disruption, and reduced muscular activity. illustrating how modern living reshapes internal physiology long before disease becomes visible. The pancreas is not a fragile organ waiting to fail. It is resilient, adaptive, and responsive to changes in metabolic demand. When the constant pressure of rapid glucose spikes is reduced, insulin requirements fall almost immediately. Blood sugar begins to stabilize not because the pancreas is repaired in isolation, but because the environment it responds to has changed. Cells regain sensitivity to insulin when they are no longer overwhelmed, allowing the pancreas to work with precision rather than force. Food quality plays a central role in this recalibration. Meals that contain fiber, protein, and natural fats slow digestion and reduce the need for rapid hormonal intervention. The pancreas responds by releasing insulin in smaller, more controlled amounts, preserving its functional capacity. Over time, this rhythm allows inflammatory signaling to quiet and enzymatic balance to normalize. Recovery does not require extreme restriction, but consistency that aligns with human biology. Movement further enhances this process. Muscle activity creates an alternative pathway for glucose disposal that reduces reliance on insulin altogether. Even modest physical activity increases insulin sensitivity for hours, sometimes days, giving the pancreas a period of metabolic rest. This rest is not inactivity, but efficiency restored. Sleep and stress regulation complete the recovery environment. Restorative sleep improves circadian alignment of insulin release, while reduced stress lowers baseline glucose output from the liver. Together, these shifts transform the pancreas from a constant responder into a responsive regulator. What emerges is not a return to some idealized state, but a dynamic balance where the pancreas operates within its design parameters. Health becomes less about correcting damage and more about removing the pressures that forced adaptation in the first place, allowing biological intelligence to express itself naturally through restored metabolic harmony.